Well, hi, everybody. It's been a while. I hope you're having a good winter because it is scarf season. I started bundling up and getting all cozy, wearing a beanie, wearing some gloves, wearing a scarf, putting on the leather jacket, looking cool, and it is cool. So, yeah, it's almost December. It's winter time. Um, it's been a bit. Things have been going on in the background, and during the time that has been since my last podcast, I thought it would be a really cool episode if I gave a book review. I've been reading. I've been reading a lot lately, and I finished a book for the first time since like the beginning of COVID. Um, and I'm not talking about comics because I've read a couple of comic books, but this was like a real actual novel, and it was like 500 to 400 pages, and it was really interesting. So, I have a lot to say about it. The book is called Wild Minds, and it is by a guy named Reid Mitenbuler. And the whole framework of the book is kind of giving you context on what animation was like back in the early days. And it really sets the tone in the beginning and continues the theme that, animation had always been ruthless. From day one, it was competitive. There was never a moment where it wasn't like safe or fun. It was exciting and it was fun, but it was also like extremely competitive. And it starts telling us a little bit about the beginning, like how animation started off as chalk drawings. I can't remember the name of the artist who did the first animation, or considered the first animation, which was stop motion photography on a chalkboard. That name escapes me. But, when it really starts to shine, when the book starts to really get to, the meat and potatoes, is with Winsor McCay, and how he basically was like the big showstopper animator. He wasn't the first animator, but he kind of brought animation to a level that no one had predicted and really wowed every single one of the animators we think of today. Like, without Winsor McCay, we wouldn't have Disney, we wouldn't have Chuck Jones, we wouldn't have, Max Fleischer. Winsor McCay was really the first big cartoonist. He wasn't the first, but he was one of the main cartoonists. And then after that, it starts to talk about the development of how it became a business. And something really interesting that I found out through reading the book was, it began as an evolution of the news strip comics. It first was taking news strips and turning them into animated versions of the news strip characters, like Little Nemo. And Max Fleischer started off with this character called, I think his name was like Bozo the Clown or something like that, and it was called Out of the Inkwell. That is really hard to say for some reason. And yeah, there was several of these mascot like characters, and the studios would pretty much be in full power. MGM, Paramount, Columbia, Universal, and these studios, they had the animators basically like comic book publishers. It's really interesting how much common ground that newspapers and comic books had in common with animation. Because, basically in comics and in animation at the time, the publishers had all the money, and the actual artists were pretty much working for scraps. And this is like, during Depression era, and throughout the history of the book, it goes from the turn of the century and ends pretty much at the 50s, at the end of the 50s and early 60s. And so you really get the feeling that, like, over the years, animation has always been a labor of love. Like, yeah, it's a business to the people, making the money, but the people who put in the sweat and tears for the animation, they were not paid very well at all. And it definitely made me appreciate that I'm an artist in 2020s, because I know if I wanted to make Rip the Falcon, I would basically have to, like, win the lottery to make Rip the Falcon back in the early days, especially like before Ralph Bakshi showed up with Fritz the Cat. Like, Fritz the Cat was basically an explosion for adult animation. We would not have the adult animated genre without Ralph Bakshi. So that's kind of off topic, but my point is that animation was pretty much like pretty restrictive and very owned by movie studios until basically the internet. I mean, as you keep going through these books, the chapters in the books, you start to really focus on two big studios. It really focuses on the Fleischer Brothers studio and Walt Disney and his gang. And you really feel the difference in their style and their tone. Like, you really feel like not only were they complete opposites in style, but they also seem to really poach each other's talent. A great example is Grim Natwick. The guy invented Betty Boop, pretty much. He designed Betty Boop, and then, Disney kept coming up to all these animators from Fleischer and hiring them. And, Pinocchio, second animated feature film by Disney, they couldn't figure out how to make Pinocchio work. So Grim Natwick made him look more like a child, and it worked. You really get context behind the themes of these films too. Like, I recently watched Pinocchio with my girlfriend, and it was really fun. And, in the book, it talks a lot about how dark it was, and it really is like the darkest Disney movie I've ever seen. And it's just got all this theming to it that's pretty crazy, and you can feel like the actual depression-ish era of Pinocchio. It's not an optimistic movie at all, and that carries through in the context of the book. And, I would say that as someone who wanted to, be in this business and, discover more about it, it really made me appreciate being an independent artist. Because, as I'm reading it, often, again and again and again, it just shows you how screwed everybody gets at the end of the day. And at the very end of the book, it talks about how Saturday morning cartoons, basically childish, they turned all these cartoons into kid stuff. And a lot of creators like Chuck Jones, he hated it. Looney Tunes was meant for adults in a lot of Warner Bros. Artists' eyes. They did not want their cartoons to be censored or watered down or changed, and a lot of that happened. And, Popeye, this was like way back in the 40s. But even back in the 40s, there was a big movement and pushback for, animation to be toned down. And a lot of animators felt like they weren't really making cartoons for children. They were really just telling jokes. And, often they were just kind of like lowbrow South Park style jokes. And it's really interesting. And I love the game Cuphead because, before the television Netflix show came out, I always thought it was kind of adult and mature. Like, Cuphead has a very, R. Crumb, racy, Tony Millionaire vibe to it. And that's totally what it was like. Like, you see, alternative comics where it takes the rubber hose style and makes it really lewd, like R. Crumb. And apparently, that is exactly what it was like. So those guys from the 60s, they just probably grew up on that stuff, and they probably were like, yep, we're just copying the old guys. It was definitely like the Wild West. Cartoons obviously didn't particularly age politically that well. It must be stated that there was a lot of racism, and women weren't treated very good in that era as well. And so, there is a lot of stuff that animation isn't really known well for, but, I think people are taking the best parts and, refitting them. There's a lot of pop culture now that is using rubber hose animation. And so there is appreciation for the art style. And a lot of the characters that we know today have persevered. Porky Pig, Daffy Duck, Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, Felix the Cat. So, there's definitely characters that have stood the test of time. But, I'd say that, it's really interesting to take a look back at all this stuff and go wow, this really was like an American art form that, Japan took and made it their own. But, animation really started in USA. The Fleischer Brothers and the Disney studio kind of made animation a powerhouse, and then other competitors started to get in. I think Columbia owned Tom and Jerry, and then Warner Brothers stepped in around the late 40s and early 50s, World War II era. And it's just so interesting to see the rivalries, because as you get I want to say about 100 pages in, you really get the feeling that competition is just fierce, and it never really lets up. The entire book is just grit. And you hear some pretty interesting and pretty explicit behind-the-scenes stuff. I'm not going to spoil it, but I'll say this. Disney was not Disney-fied. The animators were just as, they're not Boy Scouts. Definitely no goody two-shoes. I never believed in Disney magic, and by the end of this book, you won't either. But it's a good read. It's nonfiction, and it's just telling the story. It doesn't really try to be completely about the facts. It tells it in a way that's really entertaining, but it does give a lot of context and a lot of facts. In fact, one of my favorite things that I learned was that Jack Kirby, the king of comics, the man behind Fantastic Four, X-Men, and Captain America, he started out making cartoons for Fleischer, and he was an in-betweener doing Popeye and Betty Boop. And that was really interesting because not only was he probably the best illustrator in comic history, he started out working as an animator. So it must be said that Jack Kirby did it all. And I love that I wouldn't have found that out had I not read the book. You can look this up wow. You can look this online, but it's pretty little known, you know. So that was kind of like my synopsis and breakdown of this book. You can find it at Barnes and Noble. I got it about last year, around this time actually, around Christmas, and it's definitely worth your time. It was a really good read, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Reid Mitenbuler, and look for it in the art section, like the comic history section over at Barnes and Noble, or you can look at it and get it online at your local online thing. I use Amazon. I'm sorry. So I will see you next time. This was just a fun little episode that, I thought, hey, I haven't done something like this, and I definitely had a lot to say about it. Have a good one, you guys. See you next time.